This is Gary. I am going to do a short series of videos right now that is going to explain how it is that you can uh, do the survey research, Project 1, which is due the week after next. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of walk through the walkthrough. So I'm going to talk about some of the questions that I've been getting from people, and I purposefully don't like to spend too much time in class addressing tons and tons of questions about this, not because I don't care about it, but because I try to make it so that I am uh, not squelching the creative process too much. I like to have you be able to kind of think through it yourself. I think that that helps with your critical thinking skills and so forth. And so I want you to be able to do the kind of the critical analysis involved. Okay, so I'm gonna first of all, the first couple of topics I have here, I've got the on my screen over here. I brought up my survey research cheat sheet. You'll find all the stuff for Project One in on Blackboard in the under the Content tab. You click on that, and then it'll have a folder that says Survey 1 and 2, or Projects 1 and 2, rather, sorry, Projects 1 and 2. And it will show in there, it'll have two subfolders. It has one file that's just kind of a generic overview of the topics, which you can look at. And then it's got under Project 1, this is what we're going to be addressing tonight, and that is looking at what you have to do for the survey. And for the survey, the first thing that you'll want to have is download the files. It's better if you download them and open them locally if you can, just because it's a little easier. You definitely will want to download the survey template, because you're going to need to edit it, and you're going to need to be able to uh, change save it as when you make changes to it. So that you'll want to keep that, at the very least, you'll want to keep that on a, like, maybe a flash drive, or on if you have the cloud in some way, so your OneDrive or whatever it is you use. Okay, so first of all, the first thing you're going to do is need to pick a topic. The topic has to be somehow relevant to the course. So the three courses that I'm addressing here during this recording are going to be Intro to Sociology, and you're a part of that. Good job. Two, this Social Problems class. Oh, I see you back there. There you are. Okay, good. And Minority Group Relations. Oh, there you are. Good, excellent. Glad you're here. Um, and in those three classes, they're going to have slightly different topics. Obviously, intro is going to be kind of the most wide open, but in many ways, you're going to be able to with social problems, pretty much, well, many of the social problems that uh, are available, and there's no shortage. Obviously, you guys know, right? In social problems, there's no shortage of social problems in society. So all you got to do is pick one that is somehow a social problem of some sort, and then make sure that you pick something that you're interested in. Don't pick something that is boring to you, that you're not going to be, it's not going to be fun for you, because otherwise the projects 1 and 2 are going to be really awful. So for all of you, you're going to make sure that what you want to do is pick something that you want to know something about, and that'll help. It'll make the process more fun, and you'll actually want to know about the topic that you're picking. So obviously, anything that's going to be in social problems will fit into intro. Also, anything that is in minority group relations will fit into intro. Uh, I think the one that's probably going to be the most constrained in terms of topics will be minority group relations, just because it is about some very specific topics. But even then, it's very wide open. I mean, you could talk about anything. minority group relations students are in criminal justice, so maybe you want to pick something that is of interest to you that's related to criminal justice. So maybe you want to look at people people's opinions about police brutality and race. It could be a topic that you might want to be interested in. There's obviously a lot of discussion about things like issues around immigration and the question of legal immigration and illegal immigration or undocumented immigration, what to do about it, uh, all kinds of things. There's issues now around, thanks to some of our candidates, we have issues around questions of immigration having to do with Muslim Americans or Muslims entering into the country, things like that. And so those are all things that are wide open topics. Of course, those would also fit into the other classes as well. So pick a topic, make sure it's of interest to you. Then what you're going to do, download the survey template. You can just download it and save it as the name it is initially. You don't have to necessarily name it then. But once you have it and you make changes to it, you'll want to save it under a different file name, so that way you can make sure that every time you add to it, you can save it, resave it, and know what that you've made these saves, so you can have an updated file that you don't end up losing, the day before it's due, and then when you go to print it off, it's gone. For those of you who use the cloud, that's obviously very helpful to have it there, because you can access it from anywhere. It's not if you put it on a flash drive, it's great. A lot of students do that, and they carry the flash drive with them. What happens if you do it at home and you forget it? The day it's due, you're going to print it off. Not a great strategy, by the way, but regardless, so, you do it, and you're going to go print it off right before class and bring it to class, and you reach into your bag and you realize you left your flash drive at home, and then you're going to come to me and say, "Hey, Carrie, and you're going to tell me the whole sob story." If you use for those of you who use the cloud of some sort, whether it's Dropbox, or which, by the way, you can get Dropbox for free. And that would be enough room for you to be able to save a lot of your files on. That is very useful, because then you can access it from anywhere that there's web, and so you won't lose it, obviously. Okay, so that is the end of this first one. What I'm going to do next is we're going to talk about what what you're going to be doing next once you start creating some ideas. All right, be right back. And we're back. Okay, so this is the second of our little web series of how to do your survey. Remember that in project one, the survey is the only thing that you're doing, which means you're creating a survey, and you are not doing anything with it yet, not until after you get it back for a grade, so it's due week after next in this particular time frame. So what you're going to do now, you've got a topic, and you're going to have to come up with 10 or 12 statements. And the reason why I say statements and not questions is because this is going to, if you use the template, you don't have to, but if you're going to use the template, which is fine, the template is set up in such a way that it's got spaces for what we call Likert scale. Likert was just the guy that came up with this type of scale many years ago. You've seen them ad nauseum on all kinds of questionnaires you've done, and they're very useful in being able to test a range of people's opinions about attitudes. So what we're trying to measure now is people's attitudes. And so what you've got is a bunch of, actually, in this case, 12 blanks. So when I say 10 to 12, it's not a magical number. It just has to do with the fact that that's how much space there is on that particular sheet of paper. So if you want, what you could do is, I mean, if you wanted to do more, you could just simply add more spaces. However, 10 or 12 is usually about right for this size of project. So what you're going to do is you're going to have to come up with 10 or 12 statements. Uh, and as I was saying, they're statements, not questions, like in the form of a statement, not a form of a question, because with that Likert scale, it implies that not this yes or no question. So a yes or no question, say if you were wanting to know whether or not somebody likes ice cream, you would not say, do you like ice cream, which is a question, because that implies a yes or no answer. And what you have is a range. People aren't going to say, um, do you like ice cream? And they're going to say, well, I mostly agree with that, right? They're going to say yes or no. But if you put it in an I statement, like it reads, I love ice cream. Then the person who's taking the survey looks at that and says, how true is that of me? And then they say, I mostly agree with that, or I strongly agree with that. Yeah, and of course it's going to be strongly agree because everybody loves ice cream. If you don't, then something wrong with you or something. I don't know. But in this particular case, you're going to come up with 10 to 12 statements. It's going to measure attitudes, how people feel about that particular topic that you've chosen. Um, I have a couple of in that folder. There are a couple of surveys that are just ideas. One of them I think is on abortion, people's opinions about abortion, and that's set up in such a way that it is uh, because of the way that most people do in fact feel about abortion, is under what conditions are you likely to say, yes, I agree with a woman's right to have access to a safe and legal abortion, versus when do you think, under what conditions, under what circumstances do you think that women shouldn't have access to that? Now, maybe you are a full-fledged believer in keeping the government out of women's wombs, so you might believe personally that that you want to, that this is something that women should have access to it, regardless, 100% of the time, uh, and so therefore that's your own bias. We don't want to introduce our bias, though, right? We don't want to have other people telegraph to our respondents what our opinions are. So in this particular case, in that example I had, I just put in a bunch of conditions, and then I leave it up to the people who are taking it, the respondents, to decide how they feel about it. Maybe there's someone who believes that a woman should not have access to abortion 100% of the time, right? Under no circumstances. And they believe that the government should be the one who decides whether or not a woman should be able to control her own reproduction that way. So those are a range of issues of how people feel, a range of attitudes that you can measure on that. And you can also, because it's a Likert scale, you can measure the strength of that attitude. Not just do they agree with it or disagree with it, but to what degree do they agree or disagree with it? From strongly agree to strongly disagree. Excuse me. So you're going to have to come up with about 10 or 12 statements. So I would if it were me, I would get like a legal pad or something, and I would just start kind of jotting down ideas. I might think about what are the different aspects of this. So if you were interested in uh, people's opinions about, let's say, and I'm just spitballing here, I'm just I'm just thinking something on the fly. Um, say people's opinions of immigration. Well, immediately it seems like you could split immigration into how do people feel about legal immigration, documented immigration? Do they think it's a good thing, a bad thing? Are they sort of isolationistic and think that we should need to just stop immigration, or or do they believe, for example, that this is a nation of immigrants and that we should have that we should make that process as streamlined and as easy as for people as possible? You could also that part you could break down into, even if we were going to let people in, say you that's something that you think that or maybe somebody out there thinks that we should do since we're a nation of immigrants. Then the question becomes, under what circumstances? Who do we want in? Do we want to let in anyone, or do we want to let in, you know, only people that are, maybe refugees and asylees, people who are escaping some kind of persecution? Maybe we want to, if we want to think about it from an economic standpoint, we could be thinking about, should we let people in who have, extremely high skill levels? So that would help maybe certain parts of our economy. Maybe you believe that or another way to think about it is not what you believe necessarily, but what the respondents believe. Another aspect of that is, what if we, what about all of those low end jobs? What about jobs that many Americans don't even want to do because they're often very low pay, low prestige jobs, picking lettuce, for example. Who's going to do those jobs? So maybe we need immigrants for those. So realize that there's that right there, just for legal immigration, you got easily good 5 or 6 questions right off the bat. And then for undocumented immigration, you could also look at maybe figure out some different aspects of it. Um, for example, what should be the criteria, and then should we have different ways of dealing with it? What should we do about, for example, for people who came here legally, and then because of the bureaucracy and the red tape and the cost and all that stuff, because we made it so difficult to stay here sometimes once you get here. Say you come here on a visa, a work visa, and then because of all the cost and red tape and stuff, you overstay your visa and you're not able to renew it. Uh, at that point, you're now considered undocumented. You're now illegal. But in the meantime, you've been here for 20 years, and you've got kids here who are born here. Now they're U.S. citizens, right? So you can see this is a lot more complex. What are we going to do? We're going to kick those people out. They're U.S. citizens. It's unconstitutional for us to, force people that out of the country without due process if they're U.S. citizens. So okay, then what are we going to do? Are we going to split up families? Right? Are we just going to kick out the parents and leave their kids sitting there and in their house and looking at each other? Right? These are all issues, and so what I'm saying is as you think these things through, you can come up with a number of ways that that you could statements that you could make, that you could create that could measure those ideas, and so that's going to be that process of creating those statements. And again, remember their statements. Do not phrase them as questions if you're going to use that Likert scale, because that's the first thing I'm going to do if I'm looking through those. I see questions, I see question marks, or I see that they're questions. Even sometimes people they won't put the question marks. They'll just put them as questions and think apparently that I don't notice that. That's going to be the first thing I'm going to do. I'm going to be writing reword, 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 reword all the way down your sheet as I'm grading it. And of course, you're going to lose some points for that. Now, if you're doing your own survey and you're not using the template and you want to do yes or no questions, which you can do, then you can ask questions. But it's up to you. I mean, you're the researcher. You have to figure out what you want to know. Now, here's a little trick here. The first page on that are what we call attitudinal questions or attitudinal statements, right? Those are ones that are designed to measure how people feel about the topic. They're not asking factual questions. You're not asking behavioral questions. So you're not there's no place on that front page that you need to ask a question that for example, asks people, do they know someone who is an undocumented immigrant? You're not going to ask them, something about their behavior. How many times a day or a week or a month do they do something? Those are all going to be on page 2. which are what we call your demographic variables, your demographic questions. Those, if you see that on there, those have, it has age, sex, race and ethnicity, education level, income, and I believe that one's got um, religion, religious affiliation. Okay, so those first three, age, sex, and race and ethnicity, are pretty standard. I mean, I can't imagine you asking you're asking those questions, all those, doing a survey and not having those answered. So I think those are pretty much kind of written in stone. You're going to probably want to know that information. For example, you might want to know, did men answer differently than women? You might want to know what, within certain age groups that you create afterward. How did people feel about that? Do people who are under 30 feel differently than people who are 30 to 50? Right? Those are things that you might want to know. Then you're going to also need to decide those last three, whether, with education level, income level, and religiosity or religious affiliation. Do you need those? If your topic is something like abortion, religion is probably relevant to your topic, so you'll want to keep that on there. But what if you're asking about something like immigration? Well, is it relevant? I could see where it might be. I mean, if you're wanting to know, do certain religious groups or non-religious people answer differently than people who are religious or in these different groups? That might be relevant. Then again, you might also think, I may not need to know that. You're the researcher, so these are your decisions to make. You might say to yourself, well, I really don't need to know their education level because I'm giving all of my, my entire sample is going to be DMAC students, fellow students in my different classes, or they're on campus, that you're going to be handing these out to people when you get to, after you get this graded and you're moving on to the project 2. Once you get to that point, you might say, well, I'm planning on giving them all out to other DMAC students, and we're all basically freshmen and sophomores. So what good, how much information am I really going to glean from this idea of having, that question about education level? If you're giving it to a more diverse group that involves, say, you plan on having some of your professors hand it out or take it as well to compare or something like that, then maybe that is relevant then, because you'll want to know people who have graduate degrees. How do they feel differently about that than people who have less education? So you have to ask yourself. And by the way, if you don't need one of these questions, just take it out. And you might want to put in questions that are relevant to you, to your topic, and you just create them. All right, so that is the end of this one. We're almost at 15 minutes, so sorry. I'm kind of long-winded about this stuff. So I'm going to stop this one for now, and I'm going to go on to the next kind of grouping, and then we will talk about that. All right.
Yes, but as a known scientist, it was a bit surprising if the girl blinded me with something.
All right, and we're back. Okay, so this is the third of our videos, and hopefully the last one. What we're going to do now that you've got your rough draft of your statements, and I use the term interchangeably, question statements. It means the same thing. They're supposed to be in the form of statements, as I said. What the next thing on the cheat sheet is to choose your sample. Now, the reason why I actually have you choosing your sample now, even though you're not going to be handing them out to people until after you get this survey back with a grade, is because you're going to need to figure out, in terms of what with your demographic variables, what you might need to know. And so you'll that in order to make the decisions about what can you leave on there and what do you need to take off. That's going to be dependent upon who your sample is going to be. Now, I really don't care who your sample is in this sense, because we're not you're not going to be able to do a random sample, right? You're not going to so don't even call it random, right? When you get to that point, don't even say I'm going to have a random I picked a random sample of people. What you're going to do instead is you realize that with this type of sample, a random sample would allow you to generalize to a larger group of people. Say, like, if you were going to say, this is how DMAC students feel about something, you would have to, first of all, have a list of, first of all, you'd have to define what you mean by DMAC student. Is it anybody who's enrolled currently? Is it anybody who's been enrolled in the last year? Does that include online classes? Does it include people who are part-time versus people who are full-time? Right? So you'd have to define that first. Then you'd have to have a list of all those people which you don't have access to. Oh, and by the way, I don't even have access to. I'd have to have special permission to even do that, to have that list myself. You're not going to get that list. So what that has to do with is that you're going to need to decide who you're going to give it out to. So you might decide that you're going to give them all out to other DMAC students. Fine. You might also decide, depending on what your topic is, you might decide that you might want to give them out to other people. You might want to give them out to coworkers. Maybe it's relevant to where you work. So maybe if you're in criminal justice, for example, I see you out there. You're going to, maybe some of your criminal justice peers, or maybe even your professors in criminal justice, might have a unique perspective that you want to capture with your survey. Also, for example, you might want to hand them out to. So I've had people, although you have to be a little more careful with this. I've had people that were interested in having something to do with younger people, like how people in high school feel about underage drinking, say, as a social problem or as some kind of an issue. And then so they said, well, Gary, can I hand some of these out to high school students? Yes, you can, but you have to get special permission to do that. You're going to have to go through the principal of that school. Maybe it's your high school that you went to, so maybe you've got a kind of an inroad there, but you're going to have to get permission, and you might even have to do something special, like have permission slips that kids send home and have their parents sign it, because they're underage, most of them, and so it's kind of a pain in the butt. The reason why you don't have to do that in college, if you're giving them out to college students or people out in the community that are adults, is because it's called implied consent. That if you say, will you take my survey, and they have the right to say no, which means that if they do take it, they're giving consent by taking it. So with that implied consent, that sort of lets you off the hook in terms of ethics. But when you're talking about underage people, that's a whole different ballgame. So before you kind of go down that rabbit hole, make sure that you think through and talk to people about who you're going to hand it out to and that kind of thing. So you're going to figure out who your sample is going to be. Maybe, for example, you want to you're very interested in, or think it's relevant, that men might have very different opinions about this than women. Remember, we talked about, for my intro students, we talked about how Lawrence Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan, while looking at moral development, had very different ideas about who should be asked or studied. Kohlberg was the kind of the old school sexist group that only, and he only studied boys, and then said this is how people develop their morality. And why that's relevant is because Carol Gilligan came around decades later and said, you know what, we socialize men and women differently. So maybe men and women develop their morality in different ways through this because of the socialization process. Given that, if I'm asking questions about something that's relevant, that might be relevant to that there might be what we call a gender effect, I definitely want to make sure that I have like kind of a mixed bag there. So maybe I want to purposely hand out 15 to males and 15 to females in order to be able to compare those two groups when it comes to the time that I'm going to do my data analysis. Okay, so there's that. So that's having to do with your sample. You got to put some thought into it. Remember I said that the reason why I give you the template and all these other things and all these directions is because there's a lot of thinking involved in this, a lot of critical analysis, a lot of, you really kind of chewing on these things, because this is the part that I'm talking about, right? You have to think these things through, and there has to be logic behind it. Okay, so the next thing is you've got your questions or statements, and you're going to make sure that you're going to have to type them into your survey template or your own survey that you created if you want. Some people decide, for example, that they want to do them on something like online, like SurveyMonkey or Quick Surveys. Fine, you want to do that? Go for it. That way, that has some advantages, because even though if you use the free versions of these things, you have to be kind of careful because they only allow you so many questions before you have to pay for it. But many of my students have done this. They've been able to make them fit. That you can also choose some demographic variables in there. And the thing that's positive about that is sometimes you can actually get a much bigger sample size that way. And the minimum is going to be 30. But quick surveys and SurveyMonkey, you can once you create it, you get a link. You can post that on your social media. You can tweet it out to people, your followers. You can send it to friends on Facebook, and you can ask people, hey, I'm doing this survey for my class. Could you please go on and complete it for me? And sometimes you can, and maybe even share it with other people and ask them to do it too. So you can very quickly get a lot of people answering this. Oh, and by the way, the SurveyMonkey, I'm not sure about quick surveys, but SurveyMonkey will actually give you your data. So you don't even have to calculate it. It's pretty cool. And I know a lot of you guys are techno nerds like I am, so if I were to do it, that's how I would do it. I wouldn't even bother with the survey template or handing them out in person. But that's also a valuable thing to be able to do, right? To have what we call a paper and pencil questionnaire. So that's something that you could do. But when you're typing in your statements, you want to make sure that this is not a time for you to try to use your intellect and your massive vocabulary. And why? Because you want to make sure that each one of those statements is so clear and so simple that everyone that you hand it out to interprets it the same way. Now think about that for a minute. If I give you an exam, which you guys have next week, I give you an exam and I have a question on there that's really complicated, like that the wording of the question is really complicated, and some of you interpret it one way, and maybe that's how I meant for you to interpret it, but some of you read it and interpret it a different way. Am I really measuring that concept, or am I measuring just something else? And the answer is I don't know. Because if I start putting in lots and lots of big words, lots of 50-cent words, so that you think I'm really smart, that might boost my ego a little bit. But how valuable is that data going to be? So the keep it simple, stupid idea, right? Make it as simple as possible. Don't use big words. anytime you can make it simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler, the better, because that means that everyone is likely to interpret it the same way. You also want to make sure that you deal with bias. Now, let's talk just a minute about bias. You have bias. Yes, you do. And what I mean by that is that you already have an opinion about this, especially if you're picking something that you're interested in. You've already got bias. You've already got an opinion about it. You have an opinion about people's opinions about abortion. That's probably why you picked the topic. You have an opinion about undocumented immigration. That's probably why you picked the topic. Okay, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with you having an opinion about that, but we're not dealing with opinions, we're dealing with science. And we're not interested in our opinion, we're interested in other people's opinions. We're interested in their attitudes about this topic. So how do we deal with that? How do we not telegraph to them in the way we write our statements? How do we not make them realize that we have this bias? Well, there are actually ways to do this. One is that you can switch around the wording. So if I were to be asking people about their opinions about, say, undocumented immigration, I might put, one statement might say, undocumented immigrants are criminals, gang members, and drug dealers. Right? That's a real opinion that sometimes people have out there. Even some of our presidential candidates. Now, never mind that it's mostly factually false. Right? I mean, never let some facts get in the way of a good story, right? Especially in politics. But certainly, that's if that's how you feel, and that's how you put all of your statements in there as kind of with this bias going this one direction, you're going to change their opinion. At least it's going to influence how they answer those questions, and you don't want that, right? You want their true opinions about it. So how do you deal with that? Well, you can word some of your statements, maybe half of them, word them the other direction. And so instead of kind of making it sound like undocumented immigrants are bad, you might actually word it word several of them in positive ways. And you might say, undocumented immigrants are some of the hardest working people in our country. Right? So that at least is going to offset the other one. And the goal is, by the way, is not for you to not have bias, because we know you do, I do, right? Even as researchers, you're going to have some bias, but you don't want them to know what your bias is. What you want is for them to be able to take your survey and walk away from that survey not having a freaking clue what your opinion is. Does that make sense? Good. Okay. So you're going to try to get rid of any errors that are there. Do not, clean up one way to do that, as far as knowing whether or not it's simple and easy, is read it out loud. I know that sounds kind of stupid, but it really does work. If you read it out loud, this is no different than some of you have taken, your writing classes, and if you have a really good professor, they'll tell you, read out loud your what you've written. Because if you read it and then you kind of stumble over it and it just sounds awkward, it is awkward. So the same thing applies here. If you read your statements out loud and it sounds awkward, then you need to reword it. Make it simpler, right? Change the way that it's written. So that's one way that you can try to get rid of some of those kind of errors. Look for misspellings. In Microsoft Word, those are the ones with a little wiggly red line underneath. Yeah, you don't have to leave them the way they are. Really, you don't have to. You can actually go in, right-click on it, and find the correct spelling. Oh, by the way, also, two, and two. T-O, T-O-O, and T-W-O are different words. I know, it's crazy. And they mean different things. Yeah. So, don't hand in something that appears like you didn't really put much thought into it, because I can see that, and I'm a smart guy. So if you hand in something that kind of looks half-assed, um, that doesn't pump me full of confidence that you actually put much thought into this. Um, Also, so you've got errors. Clean it up, make it look good, because once you hand them out to people later on, after you get a grade, you're going to be stuck with whatever you have. You can't change it. Once you started handing them out and people start filling them out, you're stuck with whatever you have. If you have error in there, you're just going to have to deal with it or start all over. And I don't think you guys have the time for that. So, and you want to get rid of all the bias. Okay. Now, the last thing is obviously save this often, so that each time you make a change to it, you've got that saved. And then what you want to do is you're going to need to print off a copy on that you can bring to class that has your survey, because you're going to hand in a paper copy. Even if you do SurveyMonkey or something, still you're going to need to print it off. And then you're going to write your name on it, because if you don't have your name on it, I don't know who you are. Yeah, I can't give you a grade. And that's tragic. And yet somehow I'll find the strength to go on. Okay, so put your name on it and then turn it in. And what will happen is I will grade them as quickly as possible, and I will get them back to you. And once I get them back to you, what I'll do is I'll mark up. If I see something that I think is a problem that you might need to make some changes to before you actually hand them out, I'm going to write that down. I'll say reword this, or I may make some kind of comment about it. And then I will. Then you can go through it and see whether or not it's something that you need to change. And then before you hand them out to people, okay? So that's where, after you get that back, then we're going to start with project 2, and maybe I'll do some more of these videos to kind of help out with that too. But for the meantime, what you need to be doing is finishing up this project. You're not going to hand them out or anything yet. Don't hand them out to people. Instead, what you're going to do is you're just creating it, and you're going to hand it in. All right. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. Have a good weekend, as a matter of fact. What the heck? And we'll talk again.